Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon or good evening to who is with us at the International Environment House and on WebEx, and to who is now watching this video. The permanent mission of France and the permanent mission of Costa Rica to the United Nations in Geneva, Earthjustice and the Geneva Environment Network have the pleasure to welcome you today in person and virtually for an event on the Human Rights Council contributions to protecting human and natural environment. This event is organized in parallel to the 49th session of the Human Rights Council, which is concluding this week in Geneva, and is also one of the Geneva Dialogues in the run-up to the Stockholm+50 conference. 15 years ago, in 1972, the United Nations adopted the Stockholm Declaration on the human environment, opening the field of international environmental law and policy. In June this year, as you will hear from our speakers, the Stockholm+50 high-level international meeting will commemorate 50 years since this major milestone. In this perspective, to reflect at how the UN Human Rights Council and its different bodies and procedures contribute to the protection of the human and natural environment, Geneva is the home of the Human Rights Council and also the home for a large number of other institutions, from which over 100 do contribute to the global environmental agenda. This is therefore not only the right moment to have this discussion, but also the ideal place. Before we start with the opening remarks for this event, let me remind you, for those who are following online and who are more numerous than in the room, that throughout the event you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. We will use the questions to feed the discussion after the presentations. And proceeding with the opening and introductory remarks to this event, it's my pleasure to turn to His Excellency Ambassador Jérôme Bonnafont, the permanent representative of France to the United Nations in Geneva. Excellency, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you for hosting this event in this beautiful Maison de l'Environnement, qui nous apporte beaucoup ici. Excellency, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, panelists, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to open this side event co-organized by this permanent mission, the permanent mission of Costa Rica, Earthjustice and the Geneva Environment Network, in parallel to the 49th session of the Human Rights Council, and under the umbrella, as you were saying, of the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Declaration, a milestone for our ambitions. Costa Rica and France are key global allies when it comes to the preservation of the environment. In 2021, our two countries have taken the initiative to launch the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, which now unites more than 70 countries around the world, goal to effectively conserve at least 30% of our planet, land and sea, by 2030. And we are aware of the profound and far-sighted ecological commitment of Costa Rica since decades. Faced with the three environmental crises of climate change, pollution control, and biodiversity loss, the Human Rights Council took an important step in October 2021 by recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We know that environmental degradation is already causing hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions according to some calculations, due to the global warming and air pollution. Those most affected are most of the time the most vulnerable people, especially poor people, children, elderly, and women in the most vulnerable countries. If left unchecked, these developments will lead to the disappearance of entire territories. They will accentuate water scarcity and conflicts, famines, the depletion of natural resources, migrations, and thus all kinds of geopolitical disorders, leading to massive deprivation of human rights. Therefore, in the 21st century, environment and human rights cannot be considered separately. They mutually affect each other, and if not dealt with in a comprehensive manner, they can lead to tremendous disasters, both for the planet and for the fundamental human rights and well-being. Philosophically, some might consider that human rights and ecology do not necessarily go hand in hand, but practically, a human-centered ecology as well as an ecologically oriented human rights approach can reinforce each other. In order to tackle these challenges, Geneva is an important center for environmental multilateralism. Major international organizations, such as the World Meteorological Organization, the host institution for the IPCC, as well as the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, are based in Geneva or in its vicinity, as are numerous UN instruments of environmental multilateralism. Most of the UN and multilateral organizations have now an environmental division. Geneva is thus a key place to respond to the three environmental crises I previously outlined: climate, biodiversity, and pollution. Geneva is indeed a center for the production of legal norms in the environmental field, as well as for the introduction of environmental considerations into the bodies of international law, trade, health, labor, etc. A synergy between all the actors involved in normative actions can be fruitful in advancing international environmental law and better guarantees for human rights. In particular, the work of the Human Rights Council provides us with an approach in terms of fundamental rights, such as the right to a healthy environment, the right to safe drinking water, or the protection of environmental defenders that complements and reinforces the work made by other UN bodies. I am aware that a good spirit of cooperation and dialogue is already existing among special rapporteurs and their counterparts in other UN organizations. But the scattered pattern of the actors involved, as well as the very diverse rules of functioning, can sometimes make it difficult to keep an overall vision and to federate the efforts. This is the reason why occasions like today's event are truly helpful in advancing our common agenda. In the same spirit, another reason exists to enhance the relationship between human rights and environment protection structures. Both are developing a multi-stakeholder approach to discussions and negotiations. States, but also civil society, NGOs, private organizations together have to develop jointly norms as well as programs of work. This approach of multilateralism has to prosper. In practical terms, the concrete implementation of the right to a healthy environment, as well as the right to water and sanitation, can only be based on international instruments dedicated to pollution control or waste management. On the subject of pollution, for example, toxic substances and waste management, the triple COP of the Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions, which will be held in Geneva in June 2022, will once again be an opportunity to make concrete and tangible progress in international environmental governance, as well as for the strengthening of the instruments that can contribute to guaranteeing a healthier environment over the long term, and therefore the concretization of some basic human rights. Such are the reasons why France is particularly interested in this side event. I thank once again all its co-organizers and participants, and I look forward to a fruitful and concrete discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And moving on with the welcoming and introductory remarks, it is our pleasure now to turn to Her Excellency Ambassador Catalina de Vandas, the permanent representative of the Republic of Costa Rica to the United Nations in Geneva. Excellency.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. And thanks, Excellency, also to Earthjustice and the Geneva Environment Network for co-hosting this event with us. And of course, thank all of you for joining us in this important discussion. As the ambassador has said, France and Costa Rica, we have a long-standing collaboration through many of the activities that are central to our DNA, as we say, in Costa Rica, and one of them is the High Ambition Coalition for People and the Planet, in which we try to protect the 30% of our biodiversity in sea and in land. And we're very pleased to see how this coalition is gathering support as we speak, and recently with the meetings of the CVD, we saw also a stronger commitment towards the coalition. One thing that it's very important for us in Costa Rica, of course, is in relating to this conversation about how can we use the Human Rights Council to move our agenda forward, is of course the recent developments in the session of the Council 48. As you all know, last year in the session of September, Costa Rica, together with 4 other countries, decided to step up and raise the bar of what the Human Rights Council can achieve. We adopted a landmark resolution, 84/13, which recognize the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, a right that has been in existence for decades and is in fact incorporated into the legal frameworks of more than 155 states. The recognition of this right is now set to be replicated by the UN General Assembly to enhance the breadth of multilateral support in New York. This universal recognition of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment has, in a way, also set a benchmark for this year's June commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Declaration for Human Environment. And this is something that we have also been discussing with all the civil society groups. Stockholm+50 represents a key moment of reflection for our global community on what we have achieved, of course, yes, but mainly on our collective failures and how to swiftly enact the urgent transformations that we need. And there are, of course, many beacons to guide our work. We have science, the common good, transparency, and inclusivity, having people on the planet on the same level of care and attention. And of course, we have human rights. Resolution 48/13 comes at a critical moment in our plight. It is a strong human rights tool to break the barriers that have been preventing the world to achieve large-scale environmental justice. However, what we mostly need is a sound political leadership and honest, true commitment supported by enhanced and additional financial resources. This is the key of the question. Environmental human rights defenders have shown an impressive leadership, and we have to be forever grateful of the brave efforts of women, Afro-descendants, and indigenous leaders across the world who have been standing up against the devastation caused by human action through powerful cooperation and often, sadly, with the silence of some of our political leaders. But the truth is that environmental human rights defender cannot and should not be left alone to save our lives from the climate, biodiversity, ocean, and pollution crisis. They need our full support, the full support and protection of states. In this light, Costa Rica has respectfully called on all states, but especially on the COP26, COP27 climate change presidencies, and also on the COP15 biodiversity presidency to continue strengthening their leadership, ambition, and commitment with human rights by explicitly incorporating the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and beyond a human rights-based approach in all their working documents and statements, in organizing discussion events and promoting the widespread implementation of Resolution 48/13 within their respective conventions, and of crucial importance to pledge significant new financial contributions to the developing world with ease of access and without overburdening their already heavy levels of debt. Lastly, let me assure that the work in Geneva is far from done. Costa Rica will continue untiringly to raise the ambition of the Human Rights Council and the Geneva system. The Council, as a crucial player in the United Nations, has a moral responsibility to engage directly with all the United Nations conventions and programs on environment. Otherwise, it would not be properly fulfilling its mandate, that is, to promote universal respect for the protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, and make recommendations to their implementation. Let me underscore this last bit. The Council has the mandate to make recommendations. We offer Costa Rica support to present and future members of the Council to discuss and agree on innovative ways in which a rights-based approach can be incorporated into all environmental multilateral fora at global, regional, and national levels through the Council's work. Thank you very much, and I hope that we can keep working together to strengthen the Council contributions to the environmental human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency. And moving on with the welcoming and introductory remarks, it's our pleasure to turn to the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, David Boyd. David Boyd is not with us. He has recorded a message that my colleagues are going to screen.
Hello, I'm Dr. David Boyd, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, over the past decade, the Human Rights Council has really been at the forefront in knocking down the walls between human rights and the environment that previously existed. My predecessor, Professor John Knox, in his superb work over the first 6 years of his mandate, produced reports such as his comprehensive mapping report, all the way through to his framework principles on human rights and the environment, that really provided groundbreaking evidence of how intimately connected human rights and the environment are. And John's work laid the groundwork for the Human Rights Council resolution last October the 8th, resolution 48/13, where the Human Rights Council recognized for the first time at the global level that everyone, everywhere has the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This is a tremendous and historic moment in the evolution of human rights at the international level. But of course, much work remains to be done. I think it's important to consider that over the past 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused such incredible disruption in our world. And yet, over the past 2 years, pollution and toxic substances, as well as climate-related natural disasters, have caused 2 to 3 times as many deaths as the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments have spent literally trillions of dollars on vaccines, social programs, and other efforts to blunt the impact of the pandemic. And yet, in responding to the global environmental crisis, the climate emergency, the collapse of biological diversity, and the pervasive pollution of our planet, governments have been much slower to respond. And let's be perfectly clear. The impacts of the global environmental crisis constitute a human rights crisis, and the impacts fall disproportionately upon the shoulders of people who are already living in poverty, people who are marginalized or otherwise disadvantaged, exacerbating the challenges that they face in their day-to-day existence. So as we move forward, I believe there are 3 critical roles for the Human Rights Council to play. The first is to be a global champion for the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Despite its recognition in October at the Human Rights Council, we have seen resistance to its further recognition, resistance at the United Nations Environment Assembly, resistance at the Commission on the Status of Women, and resistance at the negotiations regarding the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The Human Rights Council has a role to play in ensuring that this right is uniformly and consistently recognized at all UN bodies in all UN processes. The second key role for the Human Rights Council is to advance the implementation of this right. And it can do this in multiple ways. It can do this through meetings with other international agencies and bodies. I think it would be very helpful for the Human Rights Council to have meetings, for example, with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, the Secretariat of the Biodiversity Convention, and other secretariats from multilateral environmental agreements. I think that the Human Rights Council made a terrific step forward in appointing a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. And the special procedures are already doing a tremendous amount of work to connect the dots between the various environmental challenges and the various human rights challenges that we face. Not only the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, but the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Toxics, the Special Rapporteur on Water and Sanitation, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, and many others have done thematic reports in recent years and have also highlighted environmental issues during their country visits. So this is really a holistic, comprehensive approach that the Human Rights Council could and should be taking. And certainly in terms of my mandate, one of my next big projects is the putting together a comprehensive implementation guide inspired by the Comprehensive Implementation Handbook on the Rights to Water and Sanitation produced by the former Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Water and Sanitation in 2014. And finally, the Human Rights Council also can play a critical role by ensuring that during the Universal Periodic Review process, states' performance in terms of fulfilling the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is consistently and is a consistent focus of the Universal Periodic Review process. So those are just a handful of ways in which the Human Rights Council can continue its leadership role in protecting the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Looking forward to working with all of you in the years ahead, and thanks for having me as part of this event.
So thank you very much, David. And moving on and concluding this first part of the event, it's our pleasure to turn to our colleague Haruko in New York, who is leading on the preparations for the Stockholm+50 conference. Haruko, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica and France, as well as the Geneva Environment Network and its partners for organizing this Geneva Stockholm+50 Dialogues, which is very important for us to raise awareness and also expand the community of knowledge about the Stockholm+50 and its efforts. I'd also like to thank the panelists who are present today and also for their contribution that has already been made as well as to be made for the rest of the session. My name is Haruko Kusu. As introduced, I'm acting as the principal coordinator for the Stockholm+50 Secretariat. And I'll explain a little bit about the Stockholm+50 and the preparation that has been made so far. As many of you already know, that Stockholm+50 is implemented under the auspices of UNGA Resolution 75-280 and 75-326. And UNEP Executive Director Inger Anderson has been appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations to act as the Secretary General of the International Meeting. And also the same resolution has designated UNEP to act as the focal point to cooperate and coordinate with other UN agencies and partners for the implementation of this international meeting. The theme is about the healthy planet for the prosperity of all, leaving no one behind. As you already know, that this is mainly a commemorative event, and it is not expected to have a negotiated outcome. However, this commemorative and non-negotiable nature is also providing an opportunity for us to really look at the progress made in the last 50 years, as well as the challenges that lies ahead from the lessons learned for the last 50 years, and focus on how Stockholm+50 can catalyze actions based on negotiated outcomes and processes and commitments that have been made by other multilateral fora, such as the Resolution 48/13, as referred to by Her Excellency de Vandes. We also can use this as a stepping stone or jumping board to explore cross-cutting issues such as the linkages between human rights and environment, which are often dealt with under separate silos. And there has been references about breaking silos also. And also, as His Excellency Bonafont also has mentioned, about trying to look at the linkages between human rights and environment that are often overlooked. So it allows us to be bold. We can bring in uncomfortable dialogues, unusual dialogues to the table, and we can be ambitious as well as inclusive and be action-oriented without having to go down to the negotiation table. That is basically the expectations that we have for the Stockholm+50 meeting. There are 3 organizing principles of engagement. One is about the intergenerational responsibility. Second is to be inclusive in participation and to look for interconnections. This is interconnections between generations and also between the sectors, and also to look for implementation opportunities. Now, just in terms of the logistics for the June meeting, the meeting is going to be held on the 2nd and 3rd of June in Stockholm. The convocation letter announcing the meeting has been issued earlier this month, and the invitation letters from the Secretary General will be out to the heads of state very soon. The invitation letters from the Secretary General of the International Meeting to other UN agencies and MEAs are going out as we speak. The structure of the meeting will consist of a plenary session governed by the United Nations General Assembly rules and procedures, and what's called the leadership dialogues. There are 3 leadership dialogues that are creating substantive context to the meeting, as well as a 3rd pillar, which is also as important, which is looking at stakeholder engagement at the national, regional, and different sectoral levels to make sure that this inclusivity and bringing everybody on board is really going to be brought into the mainstream of the meeting. I would also like to inform you that we just completed the preparatory meeting of Stockholm+50 this Monday at the UN General Assembly Hall in New York, and you'll be able to follow the proceedings that has been recorded on UN Web TV. Now, turning to the theme of this meeting, this particular dialogue, we'd really like to see how to mobilize the human rights communities based in Geneva to join their voices and to put an offer, a commitment, a contribution, proposals, and the dialogue to the Stockholm+50 table. Especially, we believe that the meeting offers an opportunity to explore emerging areas in support of a healthy planet that includes very important areas for your interest, which are trying to look at making universal the recently recognized human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, especially in the context of Leadership Dialogue 1, which is looking at reflecting on the urgent need for actions to achieve a healthy planet and prosperity of all, which includes looking at rights-based approaches and effective multilateralism to address intergenerational responsibility and equity. Also in Leadership Dialogue 2, which is about achieving a sustainable and inclusive recovery from COVID-19 pandemic, there has been mentioning of the importance of looking at just and inclusive and sustainable recovery and transitions. So in a nutshell, we'd really like this community, this audience that we have today, to really explore how the human rights community can really contribute and lend its voice and expertise in addressing the overall theme about how we can really cooperate together to approach for a healthy environment for all, for the prosperity of all. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Haruko, for completing these welcoming and introductory remarks. Before we move to the next session of this event, we see that there are no questions online. We'd like to turn to the room to see if there are questions here in the room. But also let me add that this event, as it hasn't been mentioned yet, that this event is also co-sponsored by the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the United Nations in Geneva. So I'm looking at the room to see if there are any clarifications that are needed after what Haruko and the other. As there are no questions, I think we can move to the second part of this event, where we are going to look at interactions between fields. And to facilitate this part and moderate this part of the event, it's my pleasure to turn to Yves Lador, who is the representative of Earthjustice here in Geneva, who will be introducing you the next speakers and facilitating the session.
Thank you very much, Dinah. Thank you to all the interventions we have just heard. And indeed, after setting the stage, we'd like to do two focus on how these two fields can be interconnected in the perspective of what Ambassador Bonafont has said about an ecologically oriented human rights-based approach, which is perhaps one of the contributions that Geneva can do for the dialogue that are coming in Stockholm, as it was just asked. The first example and first focus we would like to do is to look at the question of preserving biodiversity ecosystems, because we just finished yesterday here in Geneva the meetings of the subsidiary bodies of the Convention on Biodiversity, which will continue also later in June in Nairobi. And the first speaker for this issue is Mrs. Jackie Siles, who is the head of human rights in conservation at the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Jackie, this is quite an interesting title that you have for your function, and it shows that actually there has been a reshuffle or a reorganization within IUCN, which follows directly some of the outcomes of the recent World Conservation Congress you held in Marseille. So could you please tell us more about how IUCN now is bridging human rights and conservation, and what challenges do you see that you could better address by making such a link? The floor is yours, Jackie. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. I have a presentation, so maybe it's on?
It is.
Okay, thanks. I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak with you among such a distinguished guest and ambassador. On behalf of IUCN, I thank this panel and co-organizers for recognizing and including IUCN unique voice for this discussion in human rights and the achievement of environmental sustainability. As it was mentioned, I'm Jackie Siles, and I'm the acting head of IUCN Human Rights and Conservation Team, where we work to place emphasis in human rights-based approaches in environmental actions. We all know from headlines that conservation work can at times become drivers of human rights abuses, and we have to continue to work to ensure that all environmental activities safeguard human rights, because this failure cannot be part of the way that we protect our planet. Now, not only is the right thing to do, but it's essential because we cannot do conservation without protecting and addressing human rights. And the question here is why this is important. And because we are living in an unprecedented times, times where the globe is warming and affecting people's livelihoods, times where pandemic jump from animals to human and crash and overall systems, times where the status quo just won't work anymore because we cannot afford to leave things business as usual. And business as usual for a long time has included the systematic marginalization of our globe's most vulnerable people. Women, girls, and indigenous people bear the burden of marginalization, as well as resulting in equitable and differentiated impacts. Not only are these human rights issues a barrier for equality, but they also undermine our attempts to save the planet. Many studies, in my own experience working for almost 25 years in the environmental sector, show that women and indigenous people are also essential contributors to solving the environmental problems, and yet not exactly, and yet for that exactly reason, they are also persecuted for their defense of shared environment, our Earth. And why this? And this is why the International Union for Conservation of Nature, we work with the focus of addressing this persistent marginalization and exploitation of women and indigenous people within the context of the environmental action. As the Human Rights Council decided last year, we all have the right to a healthy and clean environment, and we need to step our protection for those who are not only the most vulnerable, but also the most powerful. And they're the most vulnerable because our system failed to prioritize them, and they're the most powerful because they are unique contributors to the progress that benefit all of us through their protection and sustainable management of nature. In today's discussion, I would like to ask, how can we work together across the human rights and conservation fields to ensure no one is left behind? I can share a little bit about how IUCN is taking these issues on. Today, IUCN is the only international governmental organization that includes indigenous peoples organization as a full and effective members. Our more recent World Conservation Congress at Marseille, for example, last year was the first time that indigenous organizations vote as part members of the Assembly. Through this space, IUCN welcomes IUCN peoples to create our global conservation priorities, because this is an essential step to respect the rights of indigenous peoples. And we are also working with indigenous members to realize their self-determined conservation priorities. And we are also working with them to ensure that biodiversity finance plays their hands and to guide the stewardship of nature. Next, please. How can we protect the defenders? We have been working with our Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy to highlight the voices of and experience of defenders. Our Congress, for example, passed last year a resolution of protecting environmental human rights defenders, including the link for the first time of a global discussion that recognized the use of gender-based violence as a tactic to silence and suppress women defenders. And more is needed to specifically highlight their challenges and to support their work and their safety. The Human Rights Council resolution of a collective right to a healthy and clean environment, and also its expert reports on the situation of indigenous environmental defenders defending their territory support this. But we should craft ways to explore how we can advance this together to leverage each other adds value for the benefit of defenders. In the conservation sector, we have facing the fact that gender responsive approaches will not be possible if we not consider gender safety. As the climate change and environmental degradation worsens our living conditions, including our access and ability to manage and benefit from natural resources, so to do social bound breaks down. Resultant tensions give rise to a domestic and intimate partner violence, with struggling families to turn to sexual exploitation and even child marriage as a negative coping strategy and respond to droughts and climate weather events. And among all these, gender neutral and blind programming can inevitably worsen the conditions. We have a collective responsive to ensure all people have their dignity and safe accounted for while we address gender-based violence and link it. So the failure to do so is a human rights failure too. I want to tell you that we have been working to expose this issue, and we launched our landmark publication in 2020, and since then we have been creating a center to support projects, practitioners, and even policy makers to close this gap. We are also launching a grant mechanism that this year we support and close close this challenge. And there is much that we can do together, and I wonder how can we work together to prevent gender-based violence risks for all people, if we know that when the environment is triggered and this issue really trigger violence. And the last one, I would like to leave with these reflections and invite you to join our efforts. I also would like to open the door to all of you to explore how our areas of action and global expertise may also strengthen your human rights work as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Siles, for this presentation of how UCN is now really openly working on the issue of human rights and in conservation. In order to build bridges, you need to build it from both sides. And after seeing how precisely IUCN is now integrating the human rights issues, let's turn to the Human Rights Council and more precisely to one of its special procedure. Of course, we all know the work which has been done, and we just heard it by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. But unfortunately, sometimes we don't pay enough attention to some other mandates which are not directly in the field of environment, but do say a lot about this link between human rights and the environment. Professor Pedro Arrojo Agudo, thank you very much for being with us. You are the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights to safe drinking water and sanitation. And in your reports, you have mentioned more than once the necessity to look at the hydrological cycles and also to have an integrated water resource management approach, which is something very well already rooted in the profession. Could you tell us more, how do you see that ecosystemic approaches can strengthen the protection of the rights that you are scrutinizing and monitoring, and how these challenges can be better approached by doing such a link? The floor is yours.
Well, Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear friends, first of all, gracias, muchas gracias, merci, vraiment, merci. Thank you for your invitation. It's a great honor for me. Well, since I took office a year ago, I have always insisted that we are facing a particularly paradoxical crisis the global water crisis on the water planet, the blue planet, with 2 billion people without guaranteed access to safe drinking water. But I always insist that although in many arid territories, climate change may make them uninhabitable due to a physical lack of water, most of these 2 billion people are not properly thirsty people without water in their living environments, but impoverished people living next to polluted rivers or aquifers, and increasingly polluted by toxic substances such as pesticides from industrial agriculture or discharges from mining and industry. This is why I insist that this global water crisis in the world is rooted in the confluence of two structural major flaws in our way of life and development. The flow of inequity and poverty that we have generated from profoundly unjust and immoral socioeconomic systems, and on the other hand, the flow of unsustainability that we have provoked in our aquatic ecosystems, turning water from being the key factor of life into the most terrible vector of disease and death that humanity has ever known. On the basis of this diagnosis, there are two axes on which I propose to focus our efforts. The first one is making peace with our rivers, wetlands, lakes, and aquifers. If we do not restore the health and functionality of the rivers, wetlands, and aquifers, on which the daily water supply of these 2 billion people, impoverished people, depends, we will not make real progress on SDG 6. To this end, it is necessary to move from managing water as a simple resource to ecosystem management based on paradigm of sustainability. Rivers can no longer be managed as water channels, but as living ecosystems. And on the other hand, second, promoting democratic governance of water as a common good from a human rights-based approach. The challenge we face with this global water crisis is not a business opportunity, but a democratic and ethical challenge. I believe that an ethical reflection on the values and functions of water is necessary. On the basis of this reflection, I propose to distinguish the following ethical categories that should be used to prioritize the different uses and functions of water. First of all, water for life. Second, water for public interest uses. Third, not first, water for economic development. And even I used to talk about water uses that threaten life. And I usually talk even in a provocative way on water crime. Well, focusing on water for life in the uses of and functions of water as a life support system, both for humans and for the biodiversity of which we are a part. The minimum amount to guarantee the drinking water and sanitation services necessary for a dignified life as a human right is water for life. Water to produce the food needed by vulnerable communities linked to the human right to food. That is also water for life. And water flows and quality necessary to ensure the sustainability of aquatic ecosystems linked to the human right to a healthy environment recently recognized by the UN. Also, that is also water for life. And it's very important to understand that arguing scarcity in the water for life space is just unacceptable, because water for life uses and functions must be guaranteed as a priority. We need to build democratic governance based on these ethical priorities. We need to build a sustainable and democratic water governance from a human rights-based approach. But for this, market logic is not the right tool. And I'm not against the free market. I used to insist that I'm against using the market to manage values that the market does not understand and does not know how to manage. In Spain, we have a motto that says, no hay que pedir peras a un olmo. That means don't ask pears from an elm tree. If you want pears, look for them in pear tree, you know. Well, advancing in the universal fulfillment of the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, that is meeting SDG 6, on the one hand, and advancing in recovering and conserving the good ecological status and health of our aquatic ecosystems are, and above all, in the current climate change outlook, recovering the good state of our underground aquifers as they are the water lungs of nature are converging challenges. I call all of you to take profit from the next World Water Conference in New York in 2023 by developing joint strategies to restore the good state of rivers, aquifers, wetlands, and aquatic ecosystems in general as an essential key in advancing in compliance with SDG 6. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your contribution. And thank you for mentioning the question of the right to food, because this gives me the opportunity to note that the special rapporteur on the right to food, Professor Vakri, is also making a very strong link between food systems and the ecosystems where they are being developed. So indeed, there is a lot to do in this field. And I'm sure that the formulation you have just done about peace with rivers is something that has a strong echo in IUCN. I look forward to the exchanges we can have when we get to the Q&A in a few minutes. You also mentioned how the question of pollutions in rivers and toxic substances we can find in rivers is a huge challenge for the right to water and sanitation. Well, let's turn now precisely on how we can push the efforts to reverse the toxic tide, which still is dominating our planet. And so for this, we have two speakers with us. Mr. Rolf Payet, who is the Executive Secretary of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. It's one of the conventions who have a synergy and a common joint secretariat. And actually, as the Ambassador of France has just said, these three conventions that we call the BRS conventions will meet soon in Geneva in June. So there have been already in this field of reversing the toxic tide a number of opportunities to have exchanges between the Human Rights Council bodies and the convention, the MEAs. So Rolf, in the work that you have been doing until now, how do you see this relationship with the human rights bodies and their publication and their work? Rolf, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves, and Excellencies and colleagues. Very good afternoon, evening, and morning to you all. Indeed, we have been working really very closely with the rapporteur, the Council as well as the UN organization. And in fact, in one of our COPs 4 years ago, we had the deputy of the Human Rights Council addressing our COPs, which lends to the importance that we give to the issue of human rights in relations to chemicals and waste, but also in creating awareness among our parties and observers on the issue of human rights. In terms of human rights, when it comes to chemicals, as you know, it's principle 1 of the Stockholm Convention actually prescribes the right to life. That's saying that man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of a quality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. And in fact, we also have a very, very close, in fact, as close as you can get in terms of human rights is the right to health. The right to health is an inclusive right. It extends not only to timely and appropriate health care, but also to the underlying determinants of good health, such as occupational health, but also environmental conditions such as the quality of food, quality of the air, quality of the soil, quality of the oceans, and the quality of the soil as well. And the Stockholm Convention in particular focuses on protecting vulnerable groups, and these include children, fetuses, infants, and also women. And as you probably all know and heard me before, the chemicals that fall under the Stockholm Convention is designed to protect those vulnerable groups from the impacts of those chemicals, which can cause cancer, can cause deformities, can cause delayed development, and a host of other health impacts. And what we've seen is that in many countries, women are still expected to perform the bulk of the domestic work, where they are exposed to indoor air pollution, but also the management of waste, which includes the burning of plastics and other types of household wastes. We also see in farming, 40% of agricultural work in developing countries is done by women and girls. And because girls and women are most likely to be illiterate as men, they are in the front lines, and as such, they are affected by the overuse and abuse of pesticides, which is, as you know, regulated under the Rotterdam Convention, and some of the pesticides which are seriously hazardous under the Stockholm Convention. There's also the issue of cultural norms that also impact on women and girls' vulnerabilities, and we have an estimated 13,000 chemicals used in beauty and hygiene products, and only about 10% have been evaluated for safety, and some of those are linked to some of the health issues I've talked about before. We also have, for example, the Inuit community in the Arctic that depends on marine mammals, seals, whales, and other mammals for very much of their livelihoods. And as you probably also know, long-range transport of many of these chemicals is accumulating in some of these species, and as a result is being transferred into the human body of humans or those communities that are dependent upon those species. This new right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment, I can refer to different decisions of our COPs, but also decisions of the UN and other MEAs that we work with. But when it comes to the right to clean water and sanitation, we also need to focus on the issue of pollution of water, and in terms of chemicals that are in this water, not only human pollution as a result of sewage or pollution from pesticides, but from the chemicals that we use that go through our washing machines, such as microplastics, and a number of other chemicals coming from detergents and other products that we use in the home. All these contribute to water pollution. The right to adequate food is also a very important area of work, especially with the Rotterdam Convention, where we work with the Food and Agriculture Administration, FAO, in order to ensure the safe and sound use of pesticides. And here the Rotterdam Convention lists at least 33 pesticides, of which a number are highly hazardous pesticides. And it calls upon countries to put in place measures and controls to ensure appropriate and safe use of those chemicals in light of the importance of having access to food and, of course, healthy and good food. The right to adequate housing is also an important area, especially, as I mentioned before, indoor pollution, the kind of substances and products that we use in construction. As you know, the Rotterdam Convention has been negotiating for many years to list asbestos. Asbestos is still affecting several populations around the world. We're still striving and urging parties to list asbestos and to reduce exposure of asbestos to communities, especially in housing and other uses of asbestos. Now, we work very closely with the special rapporteurs. We would have liked to work with the other rapporteurs, for example, the rapporteur on water and sanitation. And I think one of my suggestions is also the rapporteurs need to get together, talk together. I think I've heard about the word of silos, I've heard about the word of gaps. And I think together, by working with those special rapporteurs, it can help us to identify the gaps, identify also the synergies and the opportunities and so that we can advance this discussion forward. So my last sentence is that when we look at chemicals and waste, it touches on a wide range of human rights issues. And I hope I've given you just an insight on this wide range of HR issues that chemicals and waste are related to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ralph. And indeed, it's an interesting list of interesting examples you've provided to us about how the work that you are doing actually also contributes to the protection of human rights. And as you said, the special rapporteur on toxic and human rights, you have worked with the previous mandate holder and the current mandate holder, and we have the privilege to have Marcus Orellana with us today. Thank you, Professor Orellana, to be with us. You are going to address the next meeting of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions. How do you see precisely in this context the contribution that human rights procedures can bring to this work? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves, and thank you for the organizers to invite me to speak today on this issue of the engagement between the Human Rights Council and the special procedures and the toxics and wastes cluster instruments. I wish to start by pointing out that there has been engagement, and this engagement has been constructive and productive, and I wish to give a couple examples. The Human Rights Council, in the resolution adopted in October 2020 that renewed the toxics and human rights mandate, it placed emphasis on the information regarding, and I quote, developments, gaps, and shortcomings in the effectiveness of international regulatory mechanisms concerning hazardous substances and wastes. Similarly, the Human Rights Council resolution in October 2021 that has been mentioned, that recognizes for the first time at the global level the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, puts emphasis also it affirms that the promotion of this right requires the full implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. And so here we again see a linkage. I also want to recall and reflect that this resolution and this global recognition is a watershed moment in international policy making, in the interaction between human rights and the environment, that finds its inception in the Stockholm 1972 conference. We should not forget, looking at the preparatory works of that conference, that human rights support the conceptual narrative and foundations of the Stockholm Declaration. This we can see in the proclamation, in the principles, in the language used, and also, as I mentioned in the preparatory works, there was heated debates on several issues, but not on the human rights issues. And so there's a lot upon which we can build, and our generation in that sense is harvesting what others with their foresight had the vision to plant. In addition to these resolutions, there have been several thematic reports that have engaged the collaboration between the toxics and waste instruments and human rights. For example, the report on plastics and human rights that I presented to the General Assembly last year analyzes how the Basel Convention, the Stockholm Convention are addressing plastics. Similarly, the thematic reports on the right to science engages the issue of science policy interface platforms, and it looks in detail at how the Rotterdam Convention is failing to transform the recommendations of its scientific committee into actual measures. So the COP is failing to act on the scientific advice. This is an agenda item that will come live in the meeting of BRS that has been mentioned, scheduled for early June, coming June. And then a third example of a thematic report is the report that has been recently presented by Professor David Boyd to the Council on the right to live in a non-toxic environment as an element of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This report already expresses Rolf's suggestion of collaboration, of working together. This is a report that David and I work together closely, and it identifies multilateral environmental agreements in the toxics and waste cluster as good practices. But of course, there are implementations and compliance issues that remain challenges. And this is a second point that I'd like to highlight. MEAs have, for the most, compliance mechanisms. If we look back, the Montreal Protocol opened the door to these mechanisms that were modeled after the human rights oversight mechanisms. But these mechanisms in MEAs lack the possibility for individuals, for NGOs, for civil society to present communications to these mechanisms, to trigger investigations of compliance. And that's where the role of the mandate acts in a way as a proxy, because the mandate does receive often voluminous information regarding lack of compliance with MEAs. Now, these mechanisms are really important because they allow for the focus on attention. What are the issues that are urgent, that call for the greatest attention? In Basel, for example, is it implementation of the plastic amendment? Is it ongoing cases of illegal traffic of wastes? The example of the shipment of more than 200 containers of wastes from Italy to Tunisia comes to mind. And so this issue of compliance certainly remains an open question, and a rights-based approach would call for reform of these compliance mechanisms so that they can incorporate the opportunity for individuals and civil society to present communications. A third point that I wish to make is echoing what Rolf has mentioned, the collaboration between the special procedures, my predecessor, myself, and the BRS conventions. Messages at BRS COPs, for example, the opportunity to speak in previous COPs, the expectation that collaboration will continue, but also collaboration on capacity building initiatives. The opportunity I've had to work closely with the Secretariat, for example, on Rotterdam, on webinars and other initiatives on pesticides and human rights. To begin to conclude, let me point out a couple of things. Engagement between the special procedures of the Council and BRS, and more generally the toxics and wastes cluster, is needed today more than ever, because the human face to exposure to toxics reminds us that these problems are not abstractions. They have real world implications for real people. And despite that, the International Conference on Chemicals Management, whose 5th session is yet to be scheduled, but is critical to designing the post-2020 approach globally, is still resisting explicit human rights language. If the vision of the post-2020 is not aligned with human rights, we see a mismatch that can produce a repeat of the failed global 2020 goal, the international community not having met the goal articulated about 20 years ago in the Johannesburg summit. And we see something similar in Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, and Minamata, which often resist explicit human rights language. There are good seats upon which to build, but for example, there are certain gaps in Basel that perpetuate the north-south transfer of e-wastes that expose migrant workers, informal workers, to the hazardous chemicals in these waste streams. Similarly, we see limitations in the Minamata Convention that allow for small-scale gold mining to continue to contaminate the bodies of indigenous peoples that have nothing to do with mining, and shortcomings in the Rotterdam Convention that do not tackle the export of pesticides that are prohibited for health and environmental reasons in their countries of origins. Solutions to these problems are legitimate and effective when anchored in human rights, when anchored in a human rights-based approach, transparency, participation, accountability. We have a good foundation to build upon, but we still have much to do to reverse the toxic tide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Elena, for your contribution. Actually, it also highlights, and I could just add in some of the reflection that we could have in thinking about this 50th anniversary after the Stockholm Declaration of 1972, some improvements which have done at the regional level. I'm thinking here about the Aarhus Convention for the environmental procedural rights, which has imported actually its compliance mechanism. Although it is a multilateral environmental agreement, it has imported its compliance mechanism from the human rights system, which is exactly the same thing which happened with the Escazú Agreement, which was adopted in Costa Rica. And the Escazú Agreement is going to have its first meeting of the parties, if I'm right, in about a month or so. So indeed, it's a very interesting progress, and I think you are proposing here a very interesting food for thought for this anniversary of how more can be done in the compliance of in the field of the environment by using the human rights mechanism directly or indirectly and making these connections and articulation. Having said that, let me turn now to the questions and answers, and I'll turn back to Diana to see if we have received any questions to the different speakers.
Question in the room. So let's start by the question in the room.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's Federica Donati from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I just have a questions in relation to what is the strategy around the recognition of the right to a healthy environment in New York? As we mentioned, it would be good to have the General Assembly to have it recognized as well, but we heard from David Boyd that actually just now the Commission on Status of Women has concluded its work. And what is the text of the agreed conclusion doesn't go as far as what we would have wished it to go. So what would be the strategy and what would be the timeline around that? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Federica, for that question. And indeed, initially there was a consideration of, and of course, this is part of what our delegations and the delegations of the core group comprised by the Slovenia, Maldives, Morocco, and Costa Rica are now working on in New York. Initially, there was conversations about the Commission of Status of Women and how to perhaps channel the idea of the recognition in a resolution there. But it was later considered that it was better to have a standing alone resolution that in principle, it's currently being drafted. I don't have, we don't have the exact dates or a timeline for that. But what I can tell you is that the idea was to work towards this year before the PGA of Maldives ends, so that it could also be an opportunity for the core group of, using the spaces that we have to do it. The commitment is there. We are counting on the support of all member states as we had here. I'm pretty sure that, we doubt that we are going to have a bigger opposition than the one that we had here, but it's always a question mark, and then we call on all states to support it. It's not, and I think one thing that it's important is that the recognition was made by the Council, and we don't want to reopen that conversation. So the General Assembly resolution should take this conversation a step forward in discussing more about how states would like to translate the resolution into policy, into practice, whether the General Assembly wants to send some beacons on implementation or policies, but hopefully, and the idea is that the Council had the mandate to do it, the Council did it, and what we are doing is just moving the conversation ahead, but not reinforcing the notion of the recognition that was already made here in Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this answer on the coming challenges which are coming. I wanted also to ask to the different contributors to this really very rich discussion if there was also some questions you would like to ask to each other any elements you would like to answer. Before then, we go in a few minutes, because I know that the ambassadors have also to return to the session of the Human Rights Council, which is sitting right now. And so yeah, I don't know if Professor, the Special Rapporteur on the right to water and sanitation wanted perhaps to react, as some issues have been said. I'm thinking about what Rolf Bayer has said about the BRS, and that is concerned by the pollution of the rivers and the water. The floor is yours if ever you want to take and say a few words about that.
Well, no, I understood the question before about New York. I don't know if the person who has raised this question want to express the question I will talk about. New York opted for a nature-based strategy for guaranteeing safe drinking water for their citizens. And it was a nature-based strategy through a socio-economic agreement with the farmers, you know, in the basin, in the water basin, in order to avoid contamination. This strategy was profitable for the rural communities upstream, but it was the cheapest way of having safe drinking water, high quality water for the citizens living in New York. I think is a good example.
Thank you very much. Also, one question which has been raised concerns what is going to happen in Stockholm in June. And of course, as it was said, this will not be a negotiated outcome. It's a commemoration. But what are the perspectives, and that could be one of the questions also to ask to all of our panelists and to do a last round of comments. What are the contributions you could see coming from the dialogue that will happen in Stockholm, and that could contribute to the different linkages that we have seen right now today in this discussion? Because we see there's a number of bridges and a general overview, taking a stock taking of what has been done over the 50 years and identifying the challenges could be a very good opportunity precisely to identify these elements and to have elements to go forward. So I don't know if Ambassador Mr. Bonafont, would you like perhaps start and say what you would see as possibilities of discussions in Stockholm or perhaps beyond, or in other fora, if you think perhaps other fora might be more appropriate for that?
Thank you very much. The first remark I would say to your very important question is that if we want to act in a pragmatic manner, we have to act based on science, knowledge, and awareness. As long as you don't know the consequences of what you do to the environment or to other human beings, you cannot be taken as accountable for it. But the day you know, you are accountable for it, because then you know, knowing what you are doing. And therefore, I think that the science-based approach, which is the root base of the environmental work, has consequences on what we can say about the link between environmental policies and human rights. So number one, science-based. Number two, there is the question of human rights defenders, which has been tackled by some of the panelists. It's extremely important, and I was interested in a panel yesterday on human rights defenders and arbitrary detentions, to listen to the Hungarian member of the panel saying that environmental activists are more and more attacked, same as human rights defenders. And therefore, there is a natural alliance between those two activists, communities, human rights defenders and environmental defenders. And this also is something we have to talk about. How do you protect human rights defenders as well as environmental activists, as well as human rights defenders? And the third one is, how do you actively and concretely introduce human rights considerations in the environment treaties and bodies, and environmental considerations in the human rights work? And here, the different panelists were underlining the fact that in some instruments, it is already done. In other instruments, there is a reluctance to do it. And we find here the same logic as in WTO, for example, where human rights considerations are extremely difficult to import, if I may say so, whereas it is very necessary to do so when it comes to bounded labor or things like that. And therefore, I think that the key word here has been mentioned by several interlocutors. The key word is working together, and is synergies, and is broadening a little bit the scope, whether it be in Stockholm+50 or in the Human Rights Council, to be aware that what we are doing in one body is not distinct from what we are doing in another body, and that if we put links between all these things, we have the right approach, whereas if we keep compartmentalizing the work, institution by institution, treaty by treaty, then we miss our targets.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm sure what you said also about the science-based approach resonated with Mr. Orellana in his last report to the Council on this issue. And it's interesting to see that it's probably going to be a document that can be used in the work for the future new panel as a follow-up of the UNEA decision in Nairobi. So this is also another place of collaboration. Let me turn now to you, Ambassador Devandas, and precisely when, I mean, I don't know if you want to react on some of these elements, and also how, because you have a long, in Costa Rica, you have a long tradition, and it was said previously, of being involvement in the field of environment, in the field of human rights. Actually, it's not totally a coincidence if the Escazú Agreement has this name. For the region. So how do you see the Stockholm, the opportunity of Stockholm, and do you see a bit the same question as I asked to the Ambassador of France, perhaps other fora or specific initiatives that could help and strengthen these linkages between the two fields?
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity again. And I think, I mean, for us, there is no separation between the two fields. And frankly speaking, I think that everything that we do in environment has to be human rights based. And this is part of the fundamental, I think, perspective that we have to have. The second point is, I think that, and some of the panelists said, we cannot afford to lose any opportunity. Every single fora that we have in the common processes or in the common discussions, either here in New York and Nairobi or in any of the upcoming COPs, it's a fundamental space to advance in the solution that we have to provide to the three environmental crises that we're facing. In those crises, then we have to act not in silos and coordination based on science, but also we really need to increase the level of ambition and commitment. And we cannot do that unless we walk the talk. If we start actually implementing, putting the finances where they should be, making the right priorities, making sure that we also act in a critical way. I think that Costa Rica, for instance, has a very good record, but when I was listening to the presentation of the use of chemicals, I reflect on the challenges that my own country has with the use of chemicals and how we need to revise some of those practices. So it's raising the awareness, but it's also, I think at this point, we cannot afford not to have the leadership. So whether it's Stockholm, whether it's the next first conference of state parties of Escazú, we need to use every single opportunity to remind ourselves that without being androcentric, that human rights-based approaches are needed to solve the crisis that we have ahead of us. And thanking you for the opportunity, because I think that the discussions on what the Geneva-based and especially the human rights responses can contribute is still pending. We are still very far away from actually integrating all the human rights machinery in the right way to the discussion on the environment. I cannot, and I understand what you said, but in my mind, it's a little bit complicated to acknowledge that we have to still separate environmental defenders from human rights defenders. we really cannot afford to do that anymore. We have the mechanisms to defend and to promote, and hopefully to avoid the dreadful consequences that many of the defenders of the environment are facing around the world. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And this gives me the opportunity to note that our co-sponsors, Sweden, organized an event on environmental defenders at the beginning of this session of the Human Rights Council in support of the work which is done. Yes, and right, exactly. In which, in support of the work which is done by Norway, who has been promoting the resolution 4011 on the protection of environmental defenders that was adopted without a vote at the Human Rights Council. And I think this needs to be repeated because it shows how seriously it has been taken by the Council to strengthen the protection of environmental defenders. You mentioned the question of chemical waste discussion that you have in your own country and chemical substances in general. And I think Marcos or Elena wanted to intervene also in the discussion. And after, I will also give the floor to Haruko. You probably will have some comments also to add to what we are saying here right now. Professor Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves. I wanted to offer some thoughts on two questions that have been raised. One is on the upcoming conference, first conference of the parties of the Escazú Agreement, because as you rightly pointed out, this is an opportunity to continue to make progress in the implementation of the right to a healthy environment. Let's recall that that agreement commits the parties to guarantee this right. It is not just in the preamble as a hortatory language, but there's an actual obligation to guarantee the right. And the articulation of the various elements of procedural elements of that right, access rights into information, participation, justice, and environmental defenders give expression to that. I did want to observe that in the pre-COP that took place a couple of weeks ago, the proposal prepared by Costa Rica, St. Lucia, Uruguay, and Panama on rules of procedure for the compliance committee for that agreement takes stock of what could be described as best practice, not just good practices, but the best practices in compliance committee throughout the landscape of human rights and environment. So they incorporate individual communications, they incorporate general comments, country visits, other tools. This proposal was very warmly received at the pre-COP, and it provides a strong basis for the Escazú Agreement to serve as a model and guidance for the further developments in the policy and law in this area. That's the first point I wanted to remark. And the second, what you mentioned, Yves, on Stockholm+50 coming up and messages from the human rights community. One is that we often hear that the narrative of Stockholm, of the focus on human environment, is stale and has been replaced by the sustainable development paradigm. And I want to challenge that understanding or thesis, because if we look at the preparatory works of Stockholm+50, we see already the integration between environment and development. This point was presented forcefully by Maurice Strong in the conference itself. So the sustainable development paradigm does not replace Stockholm. It builds on, it finds its seats in Stockholm. It would not exist without Stockholm+50. And as I was mentioning earlier, and I want to reiterate, human rights were not absent in Stockholm. They were present, and they serve as the conceptual foundation of the narrative, the declaration that resulted from that conference. And so there's an opportunity to continue to build under the sustainable development paradigm and under that conceptual foundation, the integration between human rights and the environment, and all of this encapsulated under the umbrella of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Elena. And before I turn to you, as I promised, Haruko, I will now give the floor to Egypt, who have also asked for the floor. Egypt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves, and thank you to all of the speakers at this event and to the organizers. It's really been very informative and very interesting. We just wanted to really make a couple of points. First, to thank very much the special rapporteurs on human rights and the environment and on safe drinking water and sanitation for their very important remarks. And in particular, what they mentioned about the importance of ecologically oriented approaches, approaches based on ecosystems management, and we really welcome very much the words of the Special Rapporteur on Safe Drinking Water and Sanitation regarding the upcoming meeting on the review of SDG 6, the comprehensive review conference taking place in New York in May 2023, and invite all stakeholders, including, of course, the special rapporteurs, to submit their views to this review in order to make sure we have a really comprehensive way of discussing human rights related to water and how they relate to SDG 6 and SDG 6 implementation. Since 2010, the Council has been engaged on the issue of safe drinking water and sanitation, but we really feel we need to take this a step further and a step forward to look at how we can have a more comprehensive way to address SDG 6 beyond safe drinking water and sanitation. So first, just to emphasize this point, and then secondly, since there has been a bit of a mention of the climate change discussions and COP27, just to very briefly mention that as president of COP27, Egypt is very keen to have a very inclusive approach, to have an approach that addresses particular vulnerabilities and persons that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And this is why we have really talked about this being a COP for Africa and a COP for implementation. We're engaged with in a series of dialogues with a number of organizations here in Geneva, particularly those working in the humanitarian sector, to look at how climate change is intersecting with humanitarian crises and how we can have a reasonable and balanced focus on those that are most vulnerable and should not be left behind.
And thank you very much for your contribution. Indeed, Egypt has a huge challenge with the COP27, and we're looking forward to your chairmanship of this important event. And it's very important to hear that you want this to be very inclusive. And indeed, it will be the COP for Africa. You're very right. This will be a very important moment. I've promised several times, and so now I will give you the floor, Haruko. And this will be the final remark for this event, as we are getting to the end of the time that was allocated for our discussion. So, Haruko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this very rich discussion and commentaries that we have seen in this last hour and a half. I very much agree, first of all, with Mr. Orellana's comment about Stockholm, sustainable development, and human rights approaches being mutually supportive to each other. And if this has started to grow apart in the last 50 years, Stockholm plus 50 is the time to hammer this again home, to say that these are mutually supportive, and to show in what way they can be implemented in a mutually supportive manner. Especially looking at what does rights-based approach to achieving a healthy planet mean? What does just transition mean? And what just transition for jobs and skills mean to us? What does equity mean, especially for involving youth, women, and indigenous communities as agents of change rather than just vulnerable communities that we need to take care of? So I think these are the points that we'd very much like to hear, again, at Stockholm plus 50 from your expertise and your standpoints. In terms of perhaps the practicalities, I'd like to encourage you to be involved in the leadership dialogues. As I said, there are 3 themes to that. And there are actually informal working groups that are meeting to discuss about key messages and recommendations for actions that will be tabled in Stockholm. The next informal working group meetings will happen in probably mid to late April, and also another one in mid-May before the June meeting. So I very much encourage you to check the website to subscribe yourself for these informal working groups. Also, I would like to encourage you to register for the actual meeting, which is going to open in the next couple of weeks, and also to consider looking for side events, special events, or associated events, such as this one, to really promote this work and to see how we can bring human rights issues as a main pillar for the Stockholm+50 discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rocco. And this brings us to an end of this part of the dialogue. I will turn now to Diana back for the very final closing and thanking her and her teams. A lot of thanks to the work which is done by the Geneva Environmental Network. There's a lot of work behind the scene we don't see which make this possible. And I really want to thank you, Diana, and the whole of your team for that.
Thank you very much, Yves. And we want to thank all the panelists who were with us, the attendees in the room who made the effort to come back. We need to come back to the post-COVID area, and we don't know yet how it's going to look, but it looks like we have still more people online than people in the room. We want to thank all the attendees that join us online, and of course the panelists who were also with us online. And also many people will watch the video afterwards. Geneva is very busy, as you both mentioned, with delegates following many topics, and who come back also regularly to the website to watch the discussions we are having here. And with that, so just closing this event and bring to attention maybe a few other discussions that we are having here next week. We are going back discussing plastic in the run-up to 2024 with two events. One, a side event to the UN Economic Commission for Europe Regional Forum on the Sustainable Development Goals. And that event will address microplastics, and another event at the Graduate Institute, which will look at the post-UNEA and what the legally binding agreement we have all decided to work on will look at. And then, of course, we have our update. You have the special rapporteur on human rights and climate change will be the name of the special rapporteur will be unveiled this week, decided, approved by the Human Rights Council this week. So a few elements on what was discussed in relation to the environment at this session of the Human Rights Council is available on the update that is regularly updated with all the partners in Geneva that work on human rights and environmental related issues. And I think we can stop here. Thank you all.